I have signed off on the dissolution of 40,000 hulls. I want that understood before I say anything else, because it is the only thing about me that matters now. I am Vale Os, Tally Registrar of the Sable Sink, 4th grade, and for the length of my service I sat above the deepest trench the Verne Synod owns and watched dead ships go down into it and not come back. That was the whole of my work. A hull arrived under tow, condemned by a court I never met, escorted by wardens who never spoke to me, and I logged its mass and its origin and its lot number, and then I opened the render tied upon it and I logged that it was gone. I was good at this. I was the best they had. I knew the sink the way an old shepherd knows a hillside, every current and every dead pocket of it, and I believed until the day I am about to describe that I knew what was in it. The Sable Sink is not a place a Verne likes to look at directly. It sits in the black between the 3rd and 4th marches of the Synod, a wound in the dark with no star near enough to give it color, and the only light it ever held was the light we brought to it. The trench is wide enough to drop a moon into and never hear it land. We hung our tally barge above the lip of it, a long, ungainly thing of catwalks and counting rooms and tide locks, and from my window in the registry I could see down into the sink the way you might look down a well that has no bottom and no water, only more dark, going on, patient, waiting to be fed. I did not think the word waiting then. I think it now. I will not be able to stop thinking it. The render tide is the Synod's pride and the Synod's mercy, or so we were taught. It is a contaminant we made and tamed, a corrosive flood that eats the bonds that hold matter to itself. We do not break a condemned hull apart with hammers and torches like savages. We drown it. We open the tide locks and let the gray flood rise up the trench and close over the dead ship, and the tide does the rest, slowly, thoroughly, until there is nothing left but a stain that disperses and a number in my ledger. It is clean. The Synod loves things that are clean. We had sterilized whole regions this way, poured the render tide over worlds that displeased us and called it hygiene, and the galaxy had learned to be quiet about it. The tide does not care what you were. A warship and a granary dissolve at the same rate. That was the whole point. That was the comfort. The sink unmade everything that went into it equally, and in the unmaking there was no room left for any ship to be special. Earth's dead came to me 211 years ago. I was young then by the count we keep, only into my 2nd grade, and I remember the convoy because it was the largest single lot ever assigned to the sink in one tow. 1,100 hulls. Earth had lost, that is what the manifest said, lost, a small flat word, and the Synod had taken its fleet as a court takes a debtor's house, and someone in the high marches had decided that the cleanest disposal of a defeated species war machine was to drown it in the deepest hole we owned. The convoy came in under heavy warden escort, which struck me as strange even then, because dead ships do not need guarding. You do not post sentries over a corpse. But the wardens were nervous, and their captain would not dock with my barge, and when I asked the reason he gave me a look I have spent 200 years failing to forget, and said only that the things had been hard to kill, and he did not trust them to stay killed. I logged that as superstition. We Verne are a practical people and we do not indulge a soldier's nerves. I assigned the lots and I opened the locks and I drowned 1,100 ships across 30 days of patient work, and I logged each one gone, and I thought no more of it. Earth's name went out of the manifests. Within a generation it went out of conversation. The Synod is vast and forgetful, and there is always a newer enemy, a fresher march, a more interesting war, and a species that loses its whole fleet and gets it dropped in a hole does not stay in anyone's mouth for long. We forgot them. I want to be honest about that. It was not malice in the end. It was indifference, which is worse, and the sink kept its silence over them, and I tended the silence, and the years went by. There was one hull in that great lot I did not drown all the way down. I have never told anyone this. I have signed false entries on perhaps 3 occasions across my whole career, and this was the first and the worst of them, and I did it for the smallest of reasons. The hull was Lot 9 Ashen 3, a dreadnought, the largest of Earth's ships, a thing so long that when it came under tow, it took 2 full watches to pass my window. It had a name on its flank in their crude alphabet, and one of my clerks, a curious young Vern named Telu who has been dead now for a century, worked it out and told me the name was harrow. I did not know the word. I know it now. It is one of their farming words, Telu said, a tool dragged across broken ground to make it fit to plant, and also one of their underworld words, the harrowing, the breaking open of a place of the dead to bring out what is held there. Their language did that, held two meanings in one word like a closed fist, and I should have understood from that alone that we had not the slightest idea what we were drowning. When the harrow came over the lip of the sink, the render tide rose to take it as it took everything, and the gray flood climbed the dreadnought's flank, and then it stopped. Not all of it. The tide closed over the lower hull and ate the trailing structures and the long spine of it, but where the tide reached the forward third, the great blunt prow and the dark band of the bridge, it slowed and thinned and ran off the metal like water off oiled stone, and the hull beneath stayed whole. I had never seen the tide refuse a thing. I told myself it was a fault in the locks, an uneven flood, and I ordered the tide raised higher and held longer, and the harrow's prow stayed dark and whole above the gray, and the readings off its forward hull, when I bothered to take them, came back not as dead metal, but as something my instruments did not have a word for, a low, even pulse, regular as a sleeping thing's breath. I logged it dissolved. That was the lie. I logged lot 9-3 drowned and gone on the proper day, and I closed the locks and let the tide settle, and I told myself the prow had simply slipped below the surface where I could no longer see it, and I never raised the tide on it again. I cannot tell you fully why. Part of it was the workload. 1,100 hulls is a great deal of drowning, and one stubborn prow is easy to leave for later, and later never came. Part of it was Telu, who looked at the readings with me and went very quiet and said, "Registrar, it is not dead." And I told him to be quiet, and he was, for the rest of his short life. And part of it, the part I am least proud of, was that for 211 years I knew there was one ship in my sink I had not finished, and the knowing was a small private weight I carried, the way a man carries a debt he has decided not to pay, and somehow the carrying of it felt like enough. I thought I had time. The Synod always thinks it has time. We are very old and we have drowned a great many things, and nothing has ever climbed back out. The day it began was an ordinary day. I want that on the record too. There was no omen, no portent, no failing of the lights. I was at my window taking the morning tally, a fresh lot of 900 hulls under tow from the 4th March, a defeated client state whose name I have already forgotten because the Synod made me forget it, and I was running the locks to begin the drowning. The warden flotilla assigned to the sink that watch was a standard guard, 412 ships under a flag captain named Urun Dask, whom I knew slightly and disliked thoroughly, a polished officer of the high marches who treated the sink as a punishment posting, and me as the man who ran the incinerator. He had told me once, over a meal I had not wanted to share with him, that there was no duller command in the Synod than standing watch over a hole full of dead enemies. "Nothing ever happens here, Registrar," he said. "Nothing has happened here in your entire life." I had agreed with him. I had been agreeing with him for 200 years. The first sign was a tremor in the tide. I felt it through the deck before I saw it on the instruments, a long, slow shudder that ran up through the barge from below, from deep in the sink, from the dark I never looked at. The render tide is not a thing that moves on its own. It rises when I open the locks and it settles when I close them, and otherwise it lies in the trench as still as a poured floor. But it was moving now of its own accord. In a long swell that rolled up out of the deep and broke against the underside of my barge and set the catwalks ringing, and I went to my window and looked down into the sink for the first time in years with real attention, and I saw a light where no light had ever been. It was far down. It was the dull red of a banked fire, a single point at first and then a line, and then a long row of points strung along a darkness that I slowly understood was a shape, an immense shape, the forward third of a hull standing whole above the settled tide where I had left it 211 years before, and along the dark band of its bridge the windows were lit, one after another, in a slow procession of waking light. I stood at my window and I watched the Harrow open its eyes. I want to describe this carefully because the records the Synod kept afterward are lies, and because I am the only one left who saw the whole of it from the beginning, and because someone should set down truly what it is like to watch a thing you believe dead decide that it is not. The lights did not flare. There was no surge, no dramatic blaze. They came up the way a city comes up at dusk, section by section, deliberate, unhurried, as though somewhere in that vast hull a crew that had slept for 2 centuries was walking the corridors and bringing the ship back deck by deck, unbothered, in no rush at all, certain it had all the time in the world. And the readings off the hull, which for 200 years had pulsed that low, even sleeping rhythm, began to quicken and deepen and spread, until the whole forward third of the dreadnought rang on my instruments like a struck bell, and below it, under the settled tide, the parts I had drowned to nothing began to ring too, and I realized with a cold that started in my chest and spread outward that the ship was not damaged. It had never been damaged. What I had drowned was not wreckage. It was the parts of itself the Harrow had not needed while it slept. I called the flag captain. I am not ashamed of that, at least. My training held, and I did the proper thing. I opened the priority channel to Dask's flagship, and I told him the sink had an active contact, and I gave him the lot number and the bearing and the depth. He laughed at me. I have replayed that laugh in my mind 1,000 times since. He thought it was an instrument fault, or worse, that the old registrar had finally gone soft in the head from too long over the hole, and he told me, with the lazy patience of a man humoring a fool, that there were no active contacts in the Sable sink because everything in the Sable sink was dead, by definition. That was what the sink was for. And if my instruments said otherwise, then my instruments wanted cleaning. I told him a dreadnought-class hull was rising under power from a lot I had logged drowned 2 centuries ago. He stopped laughing, not because he believed me, because I had admitted, in the saying of it, that a lot I had logged drowned had not been drowned, and Dask was the kind of officer who could smell a subordinate's error the way a hunter smells blood, and he forgot the rising ship entirely in his eagerness to begin building the case that would end my career. He told me he was logging my admission. He told me there would be a court. He told me to hold position and prepare my records for review, and he did not, in all of this, give a single order to his fleet, because in his certainty that nothing dangerous could possibly be happening, he was busy with the only thing he thought was real, which was my failure. The Harrow rose while he scolded me. I watched it through the window with the channel still open, and his voice still going in my ear, and I watched the great prow break the surface of the settled tide the way a leviathan breaks the surface of an ocean, slow and enormous and streaming gray runoff down a hull that the most corrosive contaminant the Synod ever made had not so much as scratched. It came up out of the dark, and it kept coming, and I understood at last the true size of the thing I had been keeping, because the forward third I had spared was itself larger than Dask's flagship, and behind it, rising, came the spine and the trailing structures and the engine cluster that I had logged dissolved, all of it whole, all of it lit, all of it ringing on my instruments with that deep waking note. And the render tide poured off the dreadnought's flanks in gray sheets, and could not hold it, and could not eat it, and slid away defeated into the deep. This is the thing I most need you to understand. The Harrow was not clean. It was the most weathered hull I have ever logged. Its plating was scored and patched and mismatched, gray over black over a dull old red, plates of 3 different makings welded into one body across what must have been long hard service before ever it came to my sink. There were scorch marks across its prow that no Synod yard would have left unrepaired, long burns where some old enemy's fire had washed across it and failed to get through. There were dents the size of my counting rooms. It looked like a thing that had been hit by everything the dark could throw, and had simply absorbed it and gone on, and the 2 centuries in the render tide, the worst we owned, had added only one more layer of insult to a hull that had clearly stopped counting insults a long time ago. It did not look like a war machine the way Synod ships look like war machines, all polish and threat display and clean geometry. It looked like a tool that had been used very hard for a very long time and was about to be used again, and did not need to look like anything at all to do its work. It looked, I thought, and the thought turned my blood to water, like something the dark itself had given up trying to kill. I told Urun Dask to bring his fleet to readiness. I broke into his lecture and I told him, in plain words, that a Terran dreadnought of unknown capability was now fully risen and under power within his guard zone, and that he had 412 ships, and perhaps a few minutes to decide what to do with them. And for one breath I thought he had heard me, because he went silent, and then I understood the silence was not attention but offense, the particular outrage of a High March's officer who has been told his business by a barge clerk. And when he spoke again, his voice had gone cold and formal, and he said that he would deal with the contact, and that I would speak when spoken to, and that he was bringing his fleet into the sink to put a stop to whatever malfunction or sabotage or hoax was occurring on my watch. He used the word hoax. He still, even then, with the dreadnought filling my window, did not believe the ship was real in any way that could hurt him. He believed it was a problem of administration. He brought his 412 wardens down over the lip of the sink in a parade formation, a show of force meant to overawe a clerk and frighten a derelict, and the Harrow watched them come. I say watched, and I mean it precisely because the ship turned. Slow, enormous, deliberate, it brought its scarred prow around to face the descending Synod fleet, and as it turned, the windows along its bridge brightened, and across the gulf between us I felt rather than heard a single low tone, a note below sound that I have come to believe was the ship taking the measure of what had come to meet it. It did not power weapons. It did not threaten. It simply turned to face them, the way a grown thing turns to face a child that has thrown a stone, with no haste and no fear, and an attention so total that I, watching from a barge it had not even noticed, felt the weight of it press the breath out of me. 412 warships came down into the sink in formation, and one battered hull that had slept for 2 centuries turned to look at them, and any creature with sense in it would have known in that instant which of the two should have been afraid. Urun Dask had no such sense. He hailed the Harrow. I have the recording. I kept it. It is the only thing I took with me when I fled, and I have listened to it more times than is good for me. He hailed the dreadnought on the open channel, in the high formal cant of the Synod, and he ordered it to power down and submit to inspection and disposal, and he informed it that it was condemned tonnage in a Synod disposal facility, and that any resistance would be logged as an act of war against the Synod and answered accordingly. He spoke to the Harrow the way he spoke to me. He spoke to it as a clerk speaks to a number in a ledger, and the dreadnought answered him. It answered in their language, the Terran tongue, in a voice that I came to learn was not a living voice but a recording, an old order set to run when certain conditions were met. The voice of a commander 2 centuries dead carrying out an instruction she had left for a ship she had trusted to outlive her. Telu's notes, which I also kept, name her, Commander Iris Vane, last master of the Harrow, whose final standing order was logged in the ship's own records, and whose voice the dreadnought played across the open channel for the whole of the Synod fleet to hear. I did not understand the words when I first heard them. I have had them translated since. They were not a threat and they were not a plea. They were the flattest thing I have ever heard, an instruction given to a machine and the machine obeying. She said, "If they ever come to finish us, wake the ship and bring it home." And then the recording ended and the Harrow finished waking and it brought itself home, and the bringing took 19 minutes, and of Urun Dask's 412 wardens, 9 returned. I will tell you the 19 minutes as I saw them, because the Synod's account says it was a malfunction in the tide locks and a tragic accident, and that is the third great lie of my life, and I will not carry it any further. There was no accident. There was a ship that had been told to come home, and 412 obstacles between it and the door, and the patient, methodical, unhurried removal of those obstacles by a hull that did not raise its voice once in the whole of the doing. The Harrow's weapons did not announce themselves. This is what I think of most in the long watches since, when I cannot sleep, which is always. A Synod warship at battle is a spectacle. We build our weapons to be seen, great flaring discharges and lances of light, because half of war as we practice it is the breaking of the enemy's nerve before the breaking of his hull. The Harrow had no interest in anyone's nerve. The first warden to die simply ceased. I was watching the formation, and one ship in it, a heavy cruiser near the van, was there and whole, and then it was a slowly expanding cloud of its own components, and there had been no flash, no lance, no sound, only a section of the Harrow's scarred flank that had grown briefly brighter and then dimmed again, as if the ship had glanced at the cruiser and the cruiser had not survived the glance. Then a second ship, then a third. The dreadnought did not sweep its fire across the formation in the grand Synod manner. It took the wardens one at a time, in an order I could not parse but which I am certain was not random. Each ship attended to fully and then left as a dispersing cloud, while the great hull turned a fraction and attended to the next. And there was in the rhythm of it nothing of rage and nothing of joy, only the awful even patience of a thing doing a job it had done many times before and expected to do many times again. Dask ordered his fleet to fire. They were good ships and good crews. Whatever else I will say of their captain, the Synod does not arm its wardens lightly. 412 warships brought their weapons to bear on a single hull and fired, and the sink lit with the full grand spectacle of Synod war, lances and discharges and the great flaring light we are so proud of, all of it converging on the Harrow's scarred prow. And it did nothing. I do not mean the ship survived it. I mean the fire did nothing, the way a storm does nothing to a mountain, the way the render tide had done nothing for 200 years. The dreadnought's old patched plating took the combined fire of the guard fleet and grew warm, perhaps in places, and shed the heat. And the windows along its bridge did not so much as flicker. And behind those windows I could not help imagining, the ghost of a crew watching the light show with the mild patience of veterans watching recruits waste ammunition, and waiting for it to be done so they could get on with going home. When the fire slackened, the Harrow resumed its work. It had paused only, I think, to let the wardens spend themselves, the way you let a frightened animal exhaust its struggling before you do what you came to do, and then it took them apart. I watched 412 warships of the Verne Synod die in 19 minutes, and I logged it, because logging is the only thing I know how to do, and my hand shook so badly that the entries are barely readable. But I have them, the time of each ship's death to the second, the slow, even arithmetic of an entire guard fleet subtracted from the sky one hull at a time. Dask's flagship was not the first to die and not the last. The dreadnought did not single him out. That is the part I think he would have hated most if he had lived long enough to understand it, that the thing which killed him did not care who he was, did not register his rank or his certainty or his offended dignity, treated his flagship exactly as it treated the meanest warden in the formation, as one more obstacle between itself and the door, attended to in its turn, and then dispersed. He had spoken to the Harrow as to a number in a ledger. The Harrow answered him as one. The flagship's death came at the 14th minute. I had the channel still open and I heard the last of it, Dask's voice gone shrill and stripped of all its polish, ordering a withdrawal that his ships could not execute, because the Harrow stood between them and the lip of the sink and would not be gone around. And then I heard him give, at the very end, the order I had begged him to give 19 minutes before, which was to bring the fleet to full readiness. And it was far too late. It had been too late before he ever descended into the sink. It had been too late, I think, for 211 years. His flagship became a cloud, the channel closed, and the Harrow turned to the last of the wardens, and finished, and at the end of the 19th minute the sink was empty of Synod ships save for the 9 that had been near the lip, and turned and run when their captains, less certain or more wise than Dask, saw the cruiser at the van cease to exist and understood in that instant the only true thing any of us understood that day, which is that there was nothing here to fight. There was only a thing to flee. And the only question was whether you would be permitted to flee before it noticed you. 9 were permitted. I have wondered since whether the Harrow let them go on purpose, whether a thing that had been told to come home had any interest in chasing down 9 frightened wardens fleeing in the wrong direction, or whether they were simply too far and too small to be worth the turning. I incline to the first. I incline to it because of what the dreadnought did next, which was not the act of a mindless engine, but the act of something that wanted to be understood. It did not pursue the 9. It let them carry the story out of the sink and up to the high marches, let them be the witnesses, and I have come to believe it wanted witnesses, the way a creditor long unpaid wants the debtor to know exactly who has come to collect. 9 wardens fled the sable sink carrying the news that the Synod had drowned a thing that would not stay drowned, and the Harrow let them go and turned and looked at me. I felt it look at me. My barge is a small thing and an unarmed thing, and I am a clerk and not a soldier. And across the whole of the 19 minutes the dreadnought had not spared me a glance, and I had begun to hope, in the cowardly arithmetic of a creature who wants very much to live, that I was beneath its notice, that the man who runs the incinerator is not worth the burning. But when the wardens were gone, the great scarred prow came around, slow and enormous, until it faced my window, and the windows along its bridge brightened, and I stood in the light of a thing I had kept and not finished and lied about for 211 years, and I waited to be attended to and dispersed. It did not fire. It hailed me. The recording again, the dead commander's flat instructing voice, and then after it something I do not think was a recording, something that came across the channel in my own language, in the Synod cant, slow and deliberate and assembled, I am certain, out of 2 centuries of listening to the only voices that ever came near the sink, which were the wardens and the registrars, and more than any other, mine. The ship had been listening the whole time it slept. It had learned us, and it spoke to me in the language of the men who had drowned it, and what it said was not a threat. It said that it knew my name, that it had heard me sign the false entry 211 years before, that it had understood, lying in the dark, that the registrar who could not bring himself to finish the drowning was the nearest thing to mercy the Synod had ever shown it, and that for this it would let me live and carry the rest of the story, the part the 9 wardens were too frightened to wait and see. And then it showed me. The Harrow's engines lit, and it began to move, not up toward the lip of the sink and out toward the high marches where the 9 wardens fled, but along the trench, slow and low, down into the deep dark where 2 centuries before I had drowned 1,100 hulls and logged them gone. And as it passed over them, the dead woke. I watched it through my window with the same cold spreading through me that had started when the first light came up the bridge, only worse now, far worse, because I understood now what I was seeing, and the understanding was the heaviest thing I have ever carried. One by one, in the wake of the Harrow's passage, lights came up in the deep. Red and then white, banked fire and then waking windows, the same slow, deliberate procession of a crew walking the decks and bringing the ship back section by section, repeated across the whole floor of the sink, 137 times. 137 hulls that I had logged dissolved rising whole and lit out of the dark where I had left them, falling into formation behind the Harrow as it made its slow turn toward the lip of the sink and the long road up to the high marches. 1,100 ships had come into my sink 211 years before. I had drowned them, I had thought, all but one. I had been wrong about all of it. The render tide had not killed them. It had only put them to sleep, or perhaps it had not even done that. Perhaps they had only consented to lie still and let the gray flood close over them and the years go by. Perhaps they had been awake the whole time in the only way that mattered, waiting, patient, certain, for the day their commander's standing order came due. The Synod had not destroyed Earth's fleet. The Synod had stored it. We had taken the most dangerous thing a defeated enemy owned, and we had carried it to the deepest, safest, most forgotten hole we possessed, and we had tucked it into the dark and posted a guard over it and gone away and forgotten, and for 211 years we had paid a registrar to keep it. I had not been running an incinerator. I had been keeping a berth. The Sable Sink was not a graveyard. It had never been a graveyard. It was the safest harbor Earth's fleet ever had, and we had built it for them and tended it for them. And the only thing we had gotten wrong, the single small error on which everything turned, was that we had believed the dead stay where you drown them. 138 ships rose out of the Sable Sink that day. I counted them. It is the last full tally I ever made, and I made it true. They formed up around the Harrow, the great scarred dreadnought at the heart of them, and they crossed the lip of the trench where I had watched 412 wardens descend in parade an hour before, and they turned not back toward Earth, wherever Earth was, but inward toward the high marches, toward the heart of the Synod, in the direction the 9 wardens had fled with the news. They were in no hurry. That is the thing I cannot get past, the thing that wakes me. They moved at the slow, even pace of a tool dragged across broken ground, the harrow going across the field, and they did not race ahead to catch the fleeing wardens or to fall upon the Synod before it could ready itself, because they did not need to. They had waited 211 years. They could wait a little longer. They wanted, I think, to be expected. They wanted the high marches to have time to read the 9 wardens' report and to disbelieve it, and to argue about it in their clean council chambers, and to send a fleet, a real fleet, the great war fleets of the Synod heartland, and to watch that fleet go down the way the Guard had gone down, so that the disbelief could not survive a second time, so that the Synod would have to understand fully, with no comfort of doubt left to it, what it had done, and what was now coming up out of the hole to answer for it. I sit on my barge above the empty sink, and I write this because I am the only one who saw the beginning, and I will not be the one to lie about it. The Synod's account is already written, and it is false. It says 412 wardens were lost to a tide lock malfunction and a derelict's uncontrolled reactor. It does not say the word harrow. It does not say the number 1100. It does not say that a fleet is moving up from the marches at the pace of a thing that knows it cannot be stopped and is in no hurry to prove it. They have not come for me. The dreadnought kept its word. I have been let alone, the keeper of the empty berth, the one mercy in the whole black record of the sink, spared to carry the part the frightened could not wait to see. I do not know if I am grateful. I think it is its own kind of sentence to be the one who understands. Arun Dask told me, over a meal I did not want, that nothing had happened in the sink in my entire life and nothing ever would. He was a fool, but he was not entirely wrong, and that is the worst of it, the thing I turn over in the long watches when the sink lies empty and dark below my window. Nothing did happen for 211 years. The ships lay still and the tide lay still, and the years went by, and I logged my tallies and signed my entries and grew old keeping a hole I thought was full of nothing. Nothing happened, because they did not need it to. They were content to lie in the dark and let us forget them, and let us believe we had won, because they knew something we did not, something I understand now and will spend the rest of my days failing to unlearn. That you cannot drown a thing that has decided to wait, and you cannot win a war by carrying your enemy's fleet to the safest harbor in your empire, and guarding it for 2 centuries against the day it chooses to come home. We called them condemned tonnage. We called the sink a graveyard. We had a clean word for everything and a clean tide to dissolve it with, and we believed, the way the very old and very powerful always believe, that nothing we put in the dark could ever come back out. The harrow came back out. 137 came back out behind it. And somewhere up in the high marches the council is reading the 9 wardens' report and deciding it must be a malfunction, a hoax, a clerk's error, because nothing dangerous could possibly be rising out of the Sable Sink. By definition, that is what the sink was for. They are saying the things Arun Dask said. They have the same certainty he had, the certainty of a polished officer descending into a hole he believes is empty, and the fleet is coming up to meet them at the pace of a harrow across a field. And I have stopped logging tallies, because there is nothing left in the sink to count, and I have begun instead to keep this, the true record, so that when it is over there will be one Vern who wrote down what happened and did not call it an accident. The last thing I will set down is the smallest, and it is the one I cannot get past. When the Harrow turned to look at me, before it spoke, before it showed me the dead waking in the deep, I looked into the windows along its bridge, lit and steady and unflickering after 2 centuries in the worst contaminant my people ever made, and I understood that I had been wrong about the one thing I had been most sure of in all my long service. I had believed the sink unmade everything equally, that a warship and a granary dissolved at the same rate, that nothing that went into the dark could be special. I had built my whole piece on it, and I looked into those steady windows, and I knew that I had drowned 1,100 ships and only one kind of them had ever been in danger of dissolving, and it was not the ships. It was us. It was the certainty we poured over everything, the clean word and the clean tide, the belief that the dark keeps what you give it. That was the only thing in the sable sink that ever truly came apart. The Harrow watched me understand it, and then it went home.